Hello, Master Gardener newbies. Welcome back to Botany and Taxonomy for the Master Gardener. This is part 3. Let's talk about flowers. They vary a lot in color, shape, number of petals, so on and so forth. And sometimes they're found solitarily at the top of a plant, for example. And I'll start with the upper left-hand corner of the slide here. And sometimes they're born in a cluster. And those clusters may have different kind of names like an umbel, or a cyme, or spikes, racemes, corm, panicle, and on and on. Splitters, that's nirvana for you, I know. And for us lumpers, it's kind of, geez, how many more divisions can there be of flower arrangement? But the way the flowers are arranged on a plant can be very key into identifying it to species. For example, if somebody were to pick off, let's look at that flower that is in a cluster, the white one at the top of the slide. And if someone were to pick one off and give it to you, you wouldn't know how many are in a cluster, whether it's 5 or 6 or whatever number that species might have. So you don't know if you're dealing with a cluster of flowers, a solitary flower, or what. So when people bring in plants, we need leaves attached to the stem and ideally the reproductive structures. In flowering plants, that's the flowers, or the seeds or the fruits that form after the flowers are pollinated. And as you can see, the shape of flowers also have various names to them as well. Whether it's an orchid, which is a slipper shape, or tubular, or for that matter, bell shape, cup shape, pom pom, rosette, trumpet, etc., etc. There are all sorts of names. People like to split things apart, as you know, and I particularly prefer to lump and call them flowers. They're pretty to me. So I mentioned a moment ago that flowers may be born singly at the end of the stem or of a peduncle for that matter, or they may be born in clusters. Now let's look at that lower picture of the lavender colored flowers. If someone were to pick just one of those off of a plant and ask you to identify it, it may be very hard to realize that was pentas. You might be able to recognize it, but most of us would be struggling as to being exactly sure what kind of plant it was. But having an overall picture of the plant, or better yet, leaves attached to the stem, and the flowers attached to the plant aids us in identification of that particular plant in question. Okay, here we have a stylized drawing of a kind of a typical flowering plant. And as we can see, we have various structures. I won't go into all the details about every last thing, but we'll cover some of the more important parts of the plant here. First of all, you have the sepals. They're the thing that protect the flower inside the bud. From there, you have the petals, usually very colorful if it's a plant that's pollinated by an insect. Usually the petals help attract the insect and guide them into finding the pollen and where the reproductive parts are located. From there, we'll look at the right-hand side of the screen for a moment, and we have the anthers and the filaments. We'll sometimes call those the stamens, and we'll use those terms interchangeably, which isn't quite accurate, but for this course that'll be fine. Now, the anthers produce the pollen. The pollen has to get transferred over to the stigma or stigmas of that particular plant, and then the sperm germinates. The tube goes down the styles and into the ovaries. And once fertilization of the egg happens in the ovaries, then you'll get a seed to form or a fruit. I contend that most of our terms that we use in botany were stolen by the biologists. I have a feeling biologists may differ with my opinion on that, however. So again, the pollen from the male part of the plant, the stamens, has to get to the stigma, go down the styles, and then fertilize the eggs that are in the ovaries. This is how it works out in the real world. And usually plants rely on various mechanisms for pollination. One is insects. Can you think of another way plants may be pollinated? Yes, bats, birds in some cases. Hummingbirds are a great example. And of course, wind. Now flowers may be perfect, which means they have both the male and the female parts on the same flower. Many plants have that style and arrangement. Usually they have some way to prevent pollinating themselves as a result, though, too. And many plants are what we call imperfect. With that, we can divide that further down. Monoecious or monoecious, mono, one. Ecious, E-C-I-O-U-S, means house, one house. So we have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. Then we have di or dioecious. Di means two, correct? And ecious, houses. So we have separate male and female plants of that particular species. Can you think of any plant that has separate male and female plants? Take a moment. I think of hollies. Holly trees have separate male and female plants. Generally speaking, in horticulture, we prefer the female because she'll bear pretty fruits, usually in the fall into the winter. Usually red, but they may be other colors that we have cultivated for our own aesthetic beauty. Don't know why that's there. Let's talk about monoecious. Mono, one, house. So there are separate male and female plants on this particular species of tree. Do you recognize what tree species this may be? Yes, it's an oak of some sort, or Quercus, the genus. So which do you think are the female flowers in this particular slide? Yes, the upper picture are the female. You can recognize it, the acorns. Now the lower picture are the male flowers. We call them catkins for those that like to split. And catkins are, you notice, aren't very pretty. So they lack petals. Why do you think this particular flowering plant lacks petals? That's correct. It doesn't rely on an insect to pollinate it. It relies on the wind to blow pollen around. That's why when you're here in Central Florida around mid-February and about mid-March, cars are covered in that sulfury dust. We get a lot of calls that people think somebody's pouring sulfur out there, but it's the pollen from the oak tree, sometimes the pines as well, but another story for another time. So the wind blows the pollen around in hopes to find the receptive female acorns. Usually what happens is one oak tree, the female flowers are receptive at a time when the male flowers are open on a particularly different plant. This can also result in natural hybridization because of the oak pollen being blown for potentially miles away from one another. Hence my rationale for calling oak trees sluts. Here's another monoecious plant, the banana. Look at the upper picture at first. I had to marry two pictures to kind of give you a simulation of what you see out there in nature. But the upper set of flowers you can see are starting to swell. You can actually still see the remnant of the flower at the end away from where the banana is attached to the stem of the plant. The plant was pollinated at some point, and then the ovaries will swell and we will eat the delicious fruit. Of course, the bananas we have selected are tetraploid or sterile, therefore the seeds do not form. That's true of a lot of other seedless plants. They have an odd chromosome number. But that's another story. At any rate, the first bunch of flowers to open and be receptive are the female. And if we look down the stem, you can see there are little nubs where there was something attached there but no longer there. Those are sterile flowers. They're there just doing really quite frankly nothing. And then at the lower part of the photographs here, you can see there's a red bract, or what appears to be a leaf almost. And away from the camera, unfortunately, it has lifted up, and underneath there are a whole bunch of male flowers. Now the female flowers were already pollinated by another male banana tree somewhere in the neighborhood or nearby. And meanwhile, the male flowers here are going to help pollinate somebody else's banana tree nearby. Now, if you don't care if there's any more bananas forming, you can lop off the male. He's not really serving much purpose to you because you already have your bananas forming, and he's just wasting a lot of energy. Typical guy thing, huh? So here's another monoecious plant. You may not recognize it at first, but it's a Cucurbitaceae, a cucumber family member. It's hard to tell from the photograph exactly which one it is. Now, by looking at the two flowers, the one on the left with the more yellow petals and the one on the right where the petals aren't quite fully mature yet when these flowers are cut lengthwise in half, which do you think is the male flower of the two? Look closely. Hard to see, but do you see those grains of pollen at the lower part of the flower cup? Okay, you see where I'm talking about? The one on the left, there's some yellow down below. Then you kind of see a bottle-shaped structure that's kind of creamy white. And you see a whole bunch of long yellow fingers almost all put together, kind of like having all your fingers together and forming like a duckbill if you had your fingers together. Well, those are the anthers. They would produce pollen. Now the female is on the right-hand side, and that's a stigma that's in the middle of the photograph. If you look below her, you can almost see a swollen area. What do you think those are? Those are the ovaries, that's correct. You remember back a couple of slides. So this is a monoecious plant. So how does the pollen from the male get to the female in this case? Not wind, but it has a big large flower on many of the squashes. Not necessarily cucumbers, but they have yellow flowers. This is attractive to honeybees. So let's look at this Cucurbitaceae again, that cucumber family. Which flower is male and which flower is female? Take a moment and look. If you said the male is on the left, you are correct. Notice how the male flower has just a little stem below him to support him on the plant. If you look on the right hand side, we see the yellow petals, and right below the yellow petals we can see what appears to be a small squash, butternut squash of some sort maybe. And it does resemble what it'll eventually become. So the pollen from the male has to be transferred onto the female. Now, a lot of people will call you about having issues with squash not producing a lot of squashes. Why could this be? Think for a moment. Well, one of the reasons we probably thought of right away was that it wasn't pollinated. That is possible. The other possibility is that the plant is producing a bunch of male flowers all of a sudden. They can do that from time to time where they produce a whole bunch of male flowers. The male flowers will not produce squashes or cucumbers or patty pan or pumpkins for that matter. Boys don't get pregnant. So that may be the reason. Conversely, you may have a whole bunch of female flowers. And if there aren't any male flowers open and ready to have pollen ready for when the female is receptive, which is a very short amount of time, usually about a day or two, then the female flowers will wither and those ovaries will not swell and that little baby squash will wither up and die. A lot of people think something is eating them or there's something wrong. It's just usually a pollination issue. So some people will play B. Here's an example. Again, here are the male on the left and the female on the right. You can peel the petals off of the male if he is, mature enough. The petals are yellow, and you could dab it onto the stigma of the female. As you can see here, somebody has taken the flowers off of, or the petals off the male. You can see it's a male because whoever's doing this is holding it by a little thin stem. Doesn't look like a baby squash under there, pumpkin or cucumber for that matter, and he is using that to dab onto a female. You'd have to make sure it's a female flower. Again, it's easy to tell once you look below that. Then we have some plants that are dioecious. Two eachus, houses. They have separate male and female plants. In this case, it's a non-flowering plant on the planet, cycads, or sago, parenthetically palm. Sago palms aren't truly palms whatsoever. They're in the cycad family, not related to our palms whatsoever, but which are a flowering plant. So we'll get a lot of calls about people saying, I have a sago palm and I've got this feathery thing kind of coming out in the middle and it's all kind of weird looking, kind of alien almost, and I'm not sure, is it a fungus? Do I pick it off? What do I do? And I say to them, well, congratulations, it's a girl. And you can see that kind of does resemble a bunch of feathers. Well, those little feathery fingers are designed to intercept pollen from the male cone. The male cone will come up and grow very long and tall, and people try to describe this long, skinny, weird thing coming out of the middle and not sure what to do and worried about the plant and on and hem and haw. And I say, well, congratulations, it's a boy. Now, how does the pollen on a cone-bearing plant get to the receptive female cone when it has no petals? It's a wind-pollinated plant. Same with pines, for example. They're a non-flowering plant producing cones, and the wind is the mechanism for dispersing pollen. Then there are plants that are perfect. They have both the male stamens and the female pistil parts on the same flower. Almost always they have some mechanism to prevent self-pollination. Why would we want to prevent self-pollination? At least in the grand scheme of the planet, not necessarily for food or whatever. That's right, usually having offspring with too closely related of a relative causes problems for humans. Same thing with plants. In other words, it's deleterious or bad. So plants want to have DNA come from somebody that they're not as closely related to, but still within the same species. Here's a water lily. It's a perfect flower. How does it prevent self-pollination? Well, it has a unique mechanism, almost exclusive, I think, to water lily. Let's look at the flower on the left-hand side, the white one. Can you see the yellow fingers in the middle of the flower. That is correct. Those are the stamens, the boy parts of the flower. Now you can see it's very well exposed for a bee to kind of be interested in and enticed into there. And there's also nectar and stuff like that enticing it to some degree or another. But the bee is enticed into the flower, and all those fingers of pollen are going to get stuck onto his hairs or her hairs of the bee. And yes, bees use pollen as a food source, a protein source, but not all of it will be consumed by bees, and it'll eventually, hopefully, get to another water lily that is receptive. The female part is receptive. Let's look at the picture on the right. You don't see those yellow fingers so prominently anymore, but you see kind of a yellow cup. That is a stigma, the female part of this particular species of water lily, even though the color is different. So the pollen is transferred from one flower to a receptive female. Usually the male is first receptive, and the pollen is viable for that one day, and then the next day the pollen of that particular flower is not viable and has to be cross-pollinated. Pretty interesting mechanism to ensure that you don't pollinate yourself. Now lilies are a perfect flower. Think of Easter lily. Now in two dimension this is a little harder to visualize, but I think you've all seen Easter lilies. The stigma is at the lower portion of the picture here. That's the white part with a little bit of yellow on it. Now that is usually about an inch or two forward of the stamens, the yellow part. So usually that can't just naturally transfer to itself. It relies on some kind of other mechanism. Hopefully a bee didn't go first to the pollen of that particular plant and get it to the stigma of the same plant. It happens, but a lot of times those seeds just aren't very good quality or very viable in many cases. Now, corn is a monoecious plant. It has separate male and female flowers on the same plant. So which gender do you eat? Yes, you're eating the remains of the female flowers, the ovaries that have swollen after pollination. So let's look at the middle picture here on the slide. You can see that's an ear of corn starting to develop, and you can see the silk. Each silk is attached to an ovule, an ovary, if you will, and each of those have to get pollen on the silk in order for the pollen to germinate and the sperm to fertilize the ovaries. So the boy part of the plant are the tassels on the left-hand picture. The tassels are way up high and rely on the wind to move the pollen from the male onto the female. Now, the male flowers are in close-up on the right-hand side of the picture here. He's not very attractive, is he? But again, he doesn't really need to be attractive because he's not attracting an insect for pollination. He's harnessing the wind. And for those people who are allergy sufferers and you're in the upper Midwest during corn tasseling season, it can be a miserable experience because copious amounts of pollen are produced. Again, it relies on the wind. It's very chance. Now, let's go back to what we've learned about cultivars. Now, if I were to save those seeds from that corn, hybrid corn, let's say, will I get, what is the one? Yikes. Silver Queen corn from that. No, I would get corn if I planted those seeds, but not Silver Queen when I plant the seeds. Will I get Silver Queen corn when it's pollinated? Yes. But the seeds will contain different mix of DNA depending on who was the father that pollinated it. So keep that in mind when it comes to saving seeds. We do not save seeds from hybrid plants for this very reason. Now, corn is in the grass family, and grass family is probably about the third largest family of flowering plants on the planet Earth. They're very difficult to identify, but we get a lot of plants brought in, and many times we'll see many grasses being schlepped in for identification purposes. Again, a lot of times identification, especially down to the species level of flowering plants, requires the reproductive structure, which in this case would be the seed head or the flowers if they're still there. A lot of people will bring in what we call sterile grass. They'll bring in a clump of grass with no reproductive structures. It's sterile, it's not in flower at the time, and it may be a long time before it does. Bamboo is a classic example of a grass that may take a century or more to flower. So sometimes identification can be done with very minute little structures, ligules, auricles, collars, and sheaves. This is extremely difficult for the average person, and I will include myself in that. I do not identify sterile grasses, meaning it doesn't have its reproductive parts, nor will the University of Florida herbarium. So it's important when people want a grass identified, they either have to wait till it flowers or bring it in with the flowers and the seed head that it results from time going by. It can be very frustrating to the client, but again, identification is very, very difficult on grasses. By and large, we get a lot of sterile grass being brought in that can only be identified down to the family, Poaceae, the grass family. What are seeds? Have an outer coat, usually tough, kind of like an eggshell. Typically have an endosperm. That's the food source for the developing ovary inside the seed. So the endosperm is kind of like an egg white, a food source. Then you have one or two inner embryos, like an egg yolk. A good example of a plant with multiple embryos that comes to mind are beet seeds. If you've ever grown beets, you'll get three or four little beet plants growing right next to each other because that has several embryos in the seed. Now, seeds can range from being the size of dust, orchids are a classic example of that, down to something like an avocado pit, or even larger. Think of coconut, and there's something called coco de mer, coconut of the sea, or the double coconut from the Seychelles Islands. It's twice or three times the size of a coconut, weighing in about 15 to 20 pounds per seed. Amazing what nature does. It can contain one or two cotyledons. Remember cotyledons? Those are the seed leaves. If it's a monocot, grasses, sedges, palms, etc., it'll come up with one seed leaf when it first germinates. And that seed leaf will not look like the typical true leaf that'll come later. Dicots, they're broadleaf plants. When they germinate, will put out two seed leaves. Now we have plants that don't flower. For example, pine trees I mentioned. Cycads don't. Neither do ferns. They produce spores for reproduction. It's a very primitive way to do things, but it's been working for them for eons and eons and eons. Some people want these plants identified down to species. The only way you can identify ferns down to species is to provide us with a fertile frond. A fertile frond will have spore cases, as you can see in all these pictures. And those spore cases may have unique arrangement that delineates one species from another. Sometimes they'll look at the spores themselves inside those spore cases for identification purposes. So if a person brings in one frond and it is not a fertile frond, it would be very hard to identify that plant to a species level, possibly to a genus, but maybe not even that far. Now, sometimes spores are not arranged in these little sori, as they're called, these little cases, spore cases, but they may look more like velvet at the back of a leaf. Good example are the staghorn ferns. If you've ever grown them, you may have noticed on the back of some of them that all of a sudden you get this reddish brown velvety thing. A lot of people think something is wrong. That is just a fertile frond that is trying to reproduce its species. So let's go back to fruits and seeds. Fruits are the ripened and seed-bearing ovaries of flowers. Fruits are nearly varied in color, form, size, texture, and number as are flowers. That's why they're very helpful in aiding identification purposes of plants. And they can, in some cases, distinguish a species or a variety. May be harder to get it down to the cultivar level in many cases. Fruits are divided into two large categories. Splitters, this is great, isn't it? You have dry ones, and then you have fleshy ones. I heard this said by a Master Gardener newbie many years ago, who said, so basically fruits and seeds came from a pregnant flower. That is a great way to think about this. I'll give a couple of examples of dry fruits, and I don't expect you to remember all the delineations, but look at the sunflower. Those seeds are called an achene. And what's interesting is if you look in the middle of the flower, not the yellow ray flowers as you see so prettily, in the middle are the actual reproductive flowers that get pregnant, if you will, and it relied on some kind of insect to pollinate it. Now we think of honeybees pollinating a lot of plants, but a lot of things in the aster family, which sunflowers are a relative of asters or the daisies, they're usually pollinated by a lot of times by butterflies. Interesting. I'm not sure about sunflowers pollination. Probably honeybees play a big role there. But either way, it doesn't matter. And there are different types of dried fruits, zucchinis, samaras, etc. Nuts, we have a hard shell, usually one seed, indehiscent fruits, etc., etc. We won't go into all the details, but I put a picture of a peanut, and we call it a peanut even though it's not a nut. It doesn't follow the conventions of truly a nut. It's a legume, or bean and pea family. Another example of dried fruit are all our staple grain crops that we think of, the cereal grains. Fleshy fruits are usually juicy and brightly colored. Why do you think that might be? Hmm. They usually contrast with the background to make them more noticeable to animals. Why might that be? Well, if you're a plant and you produce brightly colored, fleshy fruit that is tasty or edible, you may be helping your species procreate. How so? If an animal is consuming the fruit that has the seeds in it. Well, animals eat the plant, or the fruit, I should say, and some seeds are designed to go through the digestive system of the animal and in a process with the acids in the stomach, etc. The hard seed coat is actually punctured microscopically from the acids and then passes through the animal's digestive system largely unaffected and then comes out a few days later with a little bit of fertilizer. Meanwhile, the animal is probably further away from the plant or tree that it fed upon. So that's one way to disseminate your seeds as a plant and have the apple may not far fall from the tree, but animals may move further away from the tree and disseminate the apple seeds, for example. All fleshy fruits are indehiscent, meaning you cannot peel apart like a nut. Okay, they don't like that. Yes, you can peel an apple, but that doesn't happen on its own. And has considerable fleshy tissue, which is usually a food source for somebody or something. And there are all sorts of fleshy fruits, and we won't expect you to remember the delineations, but splitters, you can absolutely study this in greater detail on your own free time. And we have stone fruits, they're called drupes. We have berries out there. We have peepos. Those are all the squashes, the gourds, the patty pans, pumpkins, and all that. I've always wondered if peepos who need other peepos are the luckiest peepos in the world. I digress. Next time you see an orange or citrus, it's a unique berry-like fruit. It's called a Hesperidium. Why is it called that? Because somebody decided to name it that. But it's an interesting thing. There are many other types of fleshy fruit, which I certainly won't go into all the details here. That's going to conclude part 3 of Botany and Taxonomy for the Master Gardener. Join me soon for part 4.